Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of The Study, myself Aman Jha, and we are continuing with the NCERT concept series. If you recall, we had completed the 6th chapter of 7th class history and we are going to move forward in this lecture. So, we shall continue. See, before we start the chapter, if you go over the contents briefly again, in the last lecture, we had talked about towns, traders and craft persons. What we saw that there are many different sorts of towns. There are religious towns, commercial towns, ports, administrative centers, and quite often they combine more than one functions. For example, Tanjavur, Hampi, etc. We saw examples of 3 cities primarily, Hampi, Masolipatnam and Surat. One was a composite city which combined a lot of functions, and then 2 were specifically port cities. We also saw that there is a maze of small towns between the large towns and the villages. There is a maze of small towns that have emerged from prosperous villages. And then we talked about the traders that live in these towns, both big, small and intermediate, and craft persons that are associated with different craft activities that primarily live in town. And depending upon the social and political importance of their craft, their place in the social hierarchy also varies. Okay, and then we had seen the 3 examples. So today we are going to focus on the chapter number 7, tribes, nomads and settled communities. Look, this chapter has some continuity to the last chapter. How? Because tribes and nomads are a very important part of trade networks of medieval period. Okay. Now trading is entirely, in modern times, trading is entirely done by corporations, companies and logistics sector. But earlier, these 2 types of societies, tribal societies and nomadic societies, were part of trade networks. They not only supplied crucial things like food, grains, etc. to urban settlements that were the focus of last chapter, they also provided rural communities with what they lacked. For example, things like sheep, goats, horses, cattle, and then things like weapons that they manufactured. Some of the tribes were good at manufacturing weapons. They provided settled communities with the forest products, export products, such things. So this chapter has certain linkages with the previous one. In this chapter, we are primarily going to focus on things like the features of tribal societies, that how do we identify a tribal society. Then we will look into examples of certain prominent tribal societies of medieval period. We will see how they lived. Sorry, not tribals but nomads. Now there is a slight difference between tribals and nomads, okay, that we shall see during the discussions. Then we will see about the proliferation of occupation-based jatis, meaning though there was a considerable population of tribals and nomads, and they continuously interacted with peasant societies, they also simultaneously were assimilated into settled societies that were primarily organized along jatis. We will look into the chapter, and then we will look into example of 2 states that emerged out of tribal societies. Okay, we will look into 2 states that emerged out of tribal societies. So let's start. First, tribes, nomads and settled communities. As the empires rose and fell, various processes continued. Look, when we demarcate history, now imagine for a moment, why did not we demarcate medieval period at the end of Delhi Sultanate and beginning of Mughal Empire? Why we have not demarcated this phase and called it some other phase? We had ancient, medieval, modern, and then in medieval we had early medieval and medieval, but we don't have anything between Delhi Sultanate and Mughal period. We take it as one continuous period of medieval India, though there were many processes that happened. There was a considerable and quantifiable difference between Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire. The robustness of empire, the legitimacy to rule, the quality of administration, there were vast differences. One could easily say that Mughal period was very different from Sultanate period. The period of Vijayanagar Empire was very different from, say, Chol Empire and such. So why we have not demarcated the period between decline of Delhi Sultanate and the rise of Mughal Empire? It's because our reason for classification or our factors for demarcating a certain period are based on certain processes that continued as the empires rose and fell. Though Delhi Sultanate ended, and it was certainly a cataclysmic event for people that were benefiting or being patronized by Delhi Sultanate, and as Mughal Empire rose, so there were certainly some people who benefited a lot from it, and there were certainly some people who lost out a lot from it. But as the political events happened, there were many social and economic processes that continued as it is. Some of them had certain variations. Therefore, this is our focus. We have always said that the dates, the political history, they are only milestones. They are not our, they are not the end of our journey. Remembering milestones, remembering political history is not studying history. Studying history involves studying these social and economic processes. Now we will focus on some of the processes in this chapter. Now, which processes continued? It says new craft, art and production activities flourished in towns and villages. Same thing was happening during Delhi Sultanate. Urbanization was picking up, new crafts were being introduced, new technologies were being introduced. Same process continues. Okay, the gunpowder technology was already around. So these things, these small scale continuous but very significant changes kept happening regardless of which empire was in place at the time. Second, expansion of peasant societies also continued, meaning the tribal and nomadic people continue, gradually they turned into peasant society. If you recall, in ancient time, we had talked about land grants, that how through land grants, peasantization of tribal society was happening. That process continued even now. Land grants remained important, though they were made to some more groups like the, iqtadars or the amirs or umras or the ulemas, the Sufi saints, the military in the terms of, military grants. So the same process of peasantization due to land grant or due to some technological changes in the case of Persian wheel and etc. The reclamation of area, reclamation of, marshlands, reclamation in places like Kaveri Delta, or introduction of new technology as in the place of Brahmaputra Valley. So due to these reasons, peasantization continued. It has been continuing since long. Now we have taken this sentence verbatim from the book. What it says, in large parts of the subcontinent, society was already divided according to the rules of Varna. Means these were settled societies and they were divided according to the rules of Varna, rules of purity and pollution, rules of caste hierarchy. These rules, as prescribed by the Brahmanas, were accepted by the rulers of large kingdoms. Now here is the key, meaning that just because the religion of ruling class underwent change during medieval period, that does not mean that there was any significant change in social conditions. Okay, that Varna based social norm was accepted by later rulers as well. If you recall that during Mughal period, the criminal law was based on Sharia, but the civil law was based on the jati rules or the caste rules or the personal rules of the communities. The same thing happened in the colonial period, that the criminal law was standardized, same for all, but the personal law was based on local norms and traditions, and same thing has continued even till now. That we have a standard IPC, we have standard CRPC, but personal law is largely based on local customs and norms and religious beliefs. So this is a very interesting point, that despite the change in the religion of ruling class, there were many new groups emerged in the many sultanates were established, many new ruling classes came up, many new states were established, but yet the social conditions continued. The pace of change varied across the region. Obviously, not only the pace, even nature of change varied across region. I mean, in some regions, the peasantization continued, but they did not get incorporated into a, Varna hierarchy. They adopted different religion, or despite becoming peasants, they retained their egalitarian values. Okay, not only the pace, but even nature of change varied across regions. Social differentiation, which is a hallmark of the peasant society, continued apace during Sultanate and Mughal period. So the social inequality, which is based on economic inequality, not only continued but even accelerated during this period. Okay, so this is a message in this one. Features of tribal societies. Okay, since we are going to focus on tribals, nomads and settled people, first we start with tribals. A tribal society isn't necessarily a forest dwelling society. Okay, remember this point. Today we often automatically associate the word tribal with forest, but forest dwellers are a subset of tribal societies. You may draw a diagram like this. If this is the tribals, then forest dwellers are here. There are other sorts of tribal societies as well. Okay, they don't follow social rules and rituals of a, now this is the hallmark or the most defining features of a tribal society. They don't follow the social rules and rituals of a jati or varna based hierarchical system. Social differentiation is much less. That means economic inequality, social inequality, and therefore political tyranny or monarchical structure, they will be absent. Strong kinship bonds is a potent tool or a potent socio-political force. So these are the most important hallmarks of a tribal society. Now that tribal society could be living anywhere. It could be living in mountains, it could be living in deserts, it could be living in forests. The point is their subsistence pattern or the nature of their economic activity, their occupation is such that there is not much in economic inequality in society. And if there would not be economic inequality, there is no reason for social inequality to exist. Okay, though there will be some ruling structure, there will be a chieftain, there will be a local raja, but since he is not rich, he cannot have standing armies, he cannot have elaborate bureaucracy, he would have no means available to impose his tyranny on the people. Therefore, his power or his position would not be as exalted as a Badshah or a Sultan or a Maharaja Dhiraj. Okay, that is the key difference. Commons were shared according to their own norms. Commons like land, say if a pasture land where your cattle grazes, or water, locally available water, such things, commons. The modern commons are internet, space, oceans. The commons for these societies will be what we call global commons that are globally, everybody has to use them. Similarly, for a tribal society, the commons will be, forest produce. If you recall the forest, things like Forest Right Acts that talks about the collective ownership rights. So that is a concept, an example of commons. So it could be either water of a nearby pond or a lake, it could be the pasture land, it could be the forest. They share them equally. So normally, I mean not always, the idea of private property is either absent or rather very weak. I mean, say suppose if there are 50 families, they will divide their land among them, but that division is not so strong that it will be the same land will be occupied by same family for generations. They may again regroup all the land and then again redistribute it, because they know that having a land is a jackpot. Someone's land might be very fertile. So if the land remains with that family, over the years they will become richer than their brethren. So they must again pool their land and then again distribute it so that everybody gets a shot at being prosperous and such things. So the commons are also divided according to their own norms. Generally, it's not the rule, not a hard and fast rule, that the idea of private property is absent or rather very weak. Okay, A combination of farming, herding, and hunting was practiced to optimize the exploitation of local resources. Since local resources are not that much, they are not abundant, they are limited, the climate is harsh, the land is not that fertile. I mean, even in forest areas, the land is not that fertile. Okay, all the fertility, all the nutrients are actually in the trees. Right? If you cut down a certain patch of Amazon forest and you start practicing agriculture there immediately, you will be disappointed. Your crops will fail because all the nutrients were in the trees and you cut them out. So the soil is very poor. Okay. So since you live in an area where local resources are not that much, you are not resource rich. So whichever activity you practice, you combine. You are hunting as well and you are herding as well. And if you have a plot of land available, you do some small scale farming, you grow your vegetables, you grow your lentils and peas and such things. But that's it. Often lived in areas where life is more difficult. And this is perhaps the most important reason why tribal societies retained their tribal identity. Because they were not resource rich. Therefore, they are equal. Okay. Now it might sound very counterintuitive, but if an area has more resources, it is inevitably going to lead to inequality. And then all the problems of a settled peasant society will come up. Okay. A complicated relationship with settled peasant societies, a tribe could be large enough. Okay, before I go there, I will like to clarify certain points on settled peasant societies. Look, reaching a stage of urbanization or having urban centers, having centralized state, urbanization, you could having a centralized state, or having craft specialization, such things, practicing long distance trade, having a very sound or rather dynamic financial system, such things, currency, money, all that is possible. All these things are possible only on the basis of a peasant society. Okay, that means even when you have prosperous cities where maybe 10, 15 or 20% of your population would be living, the rest of the people will live in villages, they will practice agriculture, and by appropriating the surplus of that agriculture in the form of taxes and trade and such thing, you can have this civilization, that urbanization, that centralized state, that long distance trade and commerce, that monetary system would not survive if you do not have a prosperous agriculture, prosperous farming, prosperous animal domestication. So when I say a peasant society, do not imagine just villages. It's a whole society at the top of which are cities and centralized empires. I mean, imagine, could the prosperity of Mughal cities and Mughal Bashas could that been possible without the the Japti system, where they could very smartly and efficiently appropriate the resources of rural areas? So, and this is very small, only 10 to 15%, or let's say be generous and say 20% of your population lives in cities. The rest of the 80 to 90% people are still living in villages, toiling away their life, having barely anything to subsist on, because the rest of the resources are being taken away by state, by the rich people and such things. And when that balance, gets disturbed, then you have problems like agrarian crisis and such. So when I am saying settled peasant society, do not think only about villages. You have everything. You have state, a very centralized one, you have cities, and you have all the trappings of modernity in medieval sense, not in modern sense. So in a 16th century Agra or in a 16th century Delhi, a person living in city must have thought ki, yes, I am living a modern lifestyle, but his modern lifestyle was based on a peasant society. So what I am saying here, that a complicated relationship existed between tribal societies and peasant societies, in the sense that they both fought with each other, but they conducted trade with each other as well. They both try to subjugate each other. I mean, the state will always try to, ensure that the tribals and nomads should settle down somewhere, practice agriculture, be good subjects, obey law and order, pay regular taxes. But tribals would resist it. They want to remain independent. They want to retain their own way of life, being mobile, being dynamic, being autonomous. They would not like the interference of state. I mean, think about the pre-1857 or even post-1857, the tribal revolts during the colonial period. That was the problem. Tribals wanted to retain their own way of life. They did not want it to be trifled with. And state, on the other hand, constantly tried to convert them into a peasant society. So this is the nature of conflict. Sometime a tribal society will become so enormous and so powerful that will start dominating the peasant societies. Take the example of Mongols. Mongols, it is widely believed that when Genghis Khan organized the desperate tribes of Mongolia, they did not have a script back then. I mean, it's a theory. It could be wrong, maybe. They only practiced, they had very little use of agriculture. Most of their needs were met by hunting and herding. And then he organized the diverse tribes of Mongolia, created a vast army, a monstrous army that swept through West Asia and Central Asia. So the world's largest empire, much larger than the Roman Empire, much perhaps larger than the Pax Britannica, was created by a tribal society. So do not take them as vulnerable victims. Once they put their mind to something, once they organize enough resources, they can cause a lot of destruction. Okay, they can be very powerful forces. So on the one hand, they had trading relations, that of course tribals will trade goods that they produced with peasant societies and vice versa. So on one hand there was cooperation, on the one hand, then on the other there was conflict, and all the while gradually tribal societies kept turning into peasant societies, either sometime under the pressure of king, either because of some technological change that they realized that now practicing agriculture is more beneficial, whatever the cause, but the direction of change was unmistakable. Never a peasant society has become a tribal society, but a tribal society has become a peasant society. Though what form it takes after becoming a peasant society, would it be incorporated into Hinduism or Islam or some other religion, Buddhism? Would it accept the Varna hierarchy, or would it remain egalitarian? That is to be seen. That will depend on the peculiar geographical and temporal conditions. But the direction of change is unmistakable. It is always from tribal to peasant. Since ancient times till now, this has always been the manner of change. Okay, we saw it here. Now here, sources to study the history of tribal people. See, contemporary historians and travelers give very little information about the tribes. Historians and travelers, though there are some examples. For example, in the case of travelers, often the British company officials that surveyed the Indian hinterland, or the British administrative officials that surveyed the hinterland, they will talk about or describe the lives and ways of tribal people. They will paint about them. They gave there is a very rich account of these miles long caravans coming from Afghanistan area to the heartland of India to sell horses. I'm forgetting that traveler's name. He has given a very vivid account of that movement. Then there are occasional differences, like for example, Ibn Battuta once says that he was traveling with one such caravan of migrants or of nomads, and they were attacked and a lot of people died. Lives were lost, properties were lost, he was injured severely. So if there are any mention, they are very indirect. Okay, we will see that have we given, no, we have not given the example of Jahangir here, but on one occasion Jahangir talks about in his biography about these tribal people, that how they used to feed the Mughal armies that were on campaigns, or how they used to transport grains from rural to urban areas and such things. Alauddin Khalji used the Banjaras to transport grain from countryside in the Doab area to the cities and to fill up the buffer stock of Delhi. So the reference by peasant society to the tribals or nomads is either little or misleading. Misleading because the word barbarian. Today, word barbarian means a savage, a wild person who lacks manners, unrefined, okay, uncouth. Doesn't, the language, they lack language, they lack script, they lack sophistication. But the origin of this term is very curious. Actually, the Roman historians who lived in Roman cities, that they were archetype representatives of Roman civilization, they described the Germanic tribes that lived across the Roman frontier. they described them as barbarians. They did not understand those tribes, they could not speak their language, they could not understand their manners, their customs, their religions, they disrespected them, thought of them as lesser beings. So whenever they were referring to them, they would describe them as barbarians. And gradually the word barbarian, became synonymous with uncivilized and savage. So this is what happens, there's this famous saying that the history will keep glorifying the hunter until the lion has his own historian. Something is very similar, something similar can be said about the tribals and nomads. They never had their own historians because in their society there was not much need or appreciation of the this art of writing, especially writing history. So if you look at someone from the prism of another society, the picture will be distorted. I mean, think about the heterodox sects like Ajivikas. They did not leave their own account. So whatever we know about them, we know from the accounts of Buddhist and Jain sources. And since they were competing for the followers, so they gave a very, unflattering account of those sects. So something similar happens here. Apart from few exceptions, tribal people did not keep written records, and those exceptions were when they became state and they at least started maintaining a rudimentary administration. But they preserved rich customs and oral traditions that were passed down to each new generation. Modern historians have started using such oral traditions to write tribal histories. The songs of, for example, the songs of Charan and Bhat, though they are written to glorify their masters and patrons, but something similar, even tribals have their own stories and their own songs in which they express themselves. They express their historical memory. Though I can't recall a song right now, I cannot sing one song right now to give you an example, but to get a point that historians listen to the song, okay, and they try to, glean out the historical memory from those songs. And then there are anthropological studies. What they do, they study the modern tribal societies that live in difficult terrain, and based on the understanding of the customs and norms and the social ways of those tribes, they try to understand that maybe this is how the tribes of medieval or ancient period lived. Okay, but it has its own challenges. We have given example of some famous tribes that are known from the sources of peasant societies. Okay, look, no important one in this part. Think about it. Why? No important one in this part. Why? Especially this one. No tribe in Kaveri Delta, Cholamandal, no, nothing. Here, nothing. Why? Why nothing here? Is because maybe in this part, primarily the tribal societies had become, either they had become insignificant, and these entire place had become, already it had become a complete peasant settled society. As we have said in the beginning, that what we say here, expansion of, he said in the large parts of the subcontinent, society was already a peasant society. Therefore, this part, it was already a peasant society. But then we have given some examples, Jatwas, Kohlis, Bhils, and then you have examples here. You have Khokhras. Now Khokhras and Ghaggars, they were very important. They gave a stiff challenge to Mahmud Ghazni and Muhammad Ghori and anyone who was trying to maintain a secure line of communication between Afghanistan and North India. They were a constant challenge. They will constantly disturb your lines of communication. From the time of Mahmud Ghori to Ahmad Shah Abdali, this was a problem always. The tribals will disturb them a lot. And then here you might recall some names like Ahoms, Nagas, Kacharis, Khasis. These names are even famous today. The Nagas are very formidable and legendary tribal class. Santhals, Oraon, Chero, Mundas, they had revolted during the colonial period. So such examples are there, and we will see in detail about some of them. What after Balochis, we have not given an example, but if you recall, when we were studying the Mughal period, we had said that the Mughals had to conduct an unsuccessful campaign against Yusufzai. Now Yusufzai were a Pathan tribe. There were other tribes as well, Afridis, there were Roshaniyas and such tribes. So even in and around the mountainous pass of Afghanistan or near the Bolan Pass or Khyber Pass, those areas had very formidable tribes that every now and then revolted because they prized their autonomy so much that they wanted to govern themselves. They did not want to submit to the authority of Mughal emperors. And the reason why Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empire is because, precisely because of this, is because whosoever tries to subjugate these people, they push back harder. Okay, because they have this such strong sense of autonomy, this strong sense of independence, and that is primarily rooted in their tribal ethos. Okay, tribal people were found throughout the subcontinent. Obviously, we saw the map. The area and influence of a tribe varied at different points of time. Some powerful tribes controlled large territories. For example, in Punjab, the Khokhar tribe was very influential. In fact, there is a body of opinion that believes that Mahmud Ghazni was killed by a Khokhar. Though another body of opinion says that no, he was killed by an Ahmadiyya. But the Khokhars, if you read things or different sources, sometimes they say this or sometimes they say that. So Khokhar tribe was very influential during the 10th and 14th century. These people continuously disrupted the Indus and surrounding areas. Continuously. Either it is even when the Delhi Sultanate was fighting or rather, struggling against the continuous Mongol onslaught, even then Khokhars were a problem for the peasant society, not problem per se. Very influential during the 13th and 14th centuries. Later, the Gakhars became more important. Their chief Kamal Khan Gakhar was made a noble or a mansabdar by Akbar. Now see what happens. That here is the beauty of mansabdari system. That okay, I know if I leave you on your own, you will keep causing trouble. I know I cannot completely subjugate you. So what do? I come to a compromise. Now you are my mansabdar. It's like they say that you make the union leader the manager of the company, and then you would have no more labor unrest. This is something like that. That you make the leader of a tribe into a mansabdar. You give him salary, you appropriate him. Now it is his responsibility to settle his people, to pacify his people. In Multan and Sindh, the Langhas, then Arghuns dominated extensive. See, you don't have to cram the name that where Gorkhas and etc. lived, especially the ones that are outside the border of India. Though you should remember the names of the ones that are inside the border of India, right? Then they give the example of Balochis, that they were divided into smaller clans. Even at the time when British annexed Balochistan, this was the practice even then, that the Baloch were divided into different smaller tribes or which were controlled by clans. Mughals faced many disturbances caused by tribes of northwest. What we said, the Afridis, Yusufzais, Roshaniyas, there were many such tribes that continuously fought them. In fact, during one such campaign against these tribes in northwestern India, Birbal died during one such campaign. So, in the western Himalayas lived the shepherd tribe of Gaddis. Now, this could be asked in prelims, okay? Because now we are concerned with the tribes of modern day India. That they are a shepherd tribe of Himalayas. Now, what do these people do? They migrate annually. During winter, they will go to the lower valleys because the temperature will be more germane, the ambience will be more favorable, and during summer, they go back to the higher reaches of mountains. Okay. The distant northeastern part of the subcontinent too was entirely dominated by tribes, Nagas, Ahoms, and many others. So you can see only few of the tribes will live in dense forests. For example, Nagas, but Ahoms, they lived in Brahmaputra Valley, right? So a tribal is not a forest dweller. We understand or categorize a certain society as a tribal society based on their social ethos of equality, social ethos of not being a peasant society, okay, and such ethos that we talked about earlier. In many areas of modern Bihar and Jharkhand, Chero chiefdoms had emerged by 12th century. Now we are talking about some chiefdoms that eventually out of tribal societies, chiefdoms emerge. But again, chiefdom is at a lower level of than kingdom. These societies, a chiefdom is more equal. The political power is more equally divided than say a kingdom or an empire. So these chieftains nominally controlled the lives of their people. Raja Man Singh, he was a very important mansabdar of Akbar, defeated the Cheros in 1591. Now, why a state, an empire, has to defeat a tribe? What is the problem? Because often it happens that an empire, say Bengal was under their control, okay? By 1573 they or 1574 they had conquered Bengal, okay? Now to go from Ganga Valley, say from the Agra to Bengal, you have to ensure that your control on riverine and roads is safe. Okay, you should be able to access them safely. You want to ensure that when provinces are sending taxes or tributes to the center, or the merchants and royal officials are going through those places are secure. But often the tribals either they attacked these routes to plunder something so that it can add to their meager income, or sometimes state thought that these tribes live on an area where there is a lot of resources like elephant, resources like timber. So there was this conflict for resources, and who was the aggressor, who was the victim, that is not the that is outside the scope of studying history. Let's just study history the way it has happened without assigning moral responsibility. Then he said a large booty was taken from them, but they were not entirely subdued. Under Aurangzeb, Mughals captured many Chero fortresses and subjugated the tribe. Though we say fortress, but don't take this word strongly. Don't think in terms of a fortress of Shahjahanabad or a fortress of Fatehpur Sikri. These are mostly wooden structures with very as much as a tribal society can afford, only that much. Okay. Under Aurangzeb, they subjugated them. The Mundas and Santhals were other important tribes who lived in the region. Now, these tribes are more well known for the things like Munda Ulgulan or Santhal rebellion, such things. Because A, they lived deeper into the forest, so their interaction with the empires of medieval India was less. It is only with the arrival of colonial rule that perhaps the latest phase of an intense struggle between a settled peasant society and tribal way of life started, because the colonial rule was ruthless. It And since they came from a different world, they saw these tribes as a source of disturbance. There was this law called Habitual Offenders Act, that if simply because you belong to a nomadic tribe, now you are a criminal, because since you move from one place to other, you must be doing disturbances. This was their way of thinking. They imagined the world, their ideal world was of a peasant society, that people should either live in cities or live in countryside, practice farming, pay taxes, be good citizen, do not cause disturbances. They simply did not understand that how people could move from one place to another. So they were hell bent on stopping such ending such way of life, and they wanted to extend agriculture as far as possible so that they can tax it and use it in their trade. They wanted to control forest resources as much as possible so that they can again use it for the trade. So the conflict, if there was conflict between a tribal way of life and a settled way of life in medieval period, it became far more severe and far more nasty during the colonial period. They have given some more examples of Maharashtra highlands and Karnataka: Kolis, Berads, Korgas, Vitaras, Marwars, Bhils and Gonds. We will study about Gonds in the next example. Okay, you can just read through them. Okay, the Gonds were found in great numbers across the present day states of Chhattisgarh, MP, Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. Do remember this information. Okay, here how nomads and mobile people lived. Okay, now earlier we said the word tribal society, and now we are talking about nomad. They are not equal, but they are not completely separate as well. We can talk about them in this sense. Okay, say this is a tribal society, this is a nomad society, and this is their common set. This is a tribal society, this is a nomad society, and this is the common set. Meaning some tribes are nomads, okay, but not all of them. Similarly, some nomadic societies are tribal, but not all of them. Okay. though it will be very difficult to find an example of a nomadic society that is not tribal. They moved over long distances, okay, with their animals. They also exchanged wool, ghee, etc. with settled agriculturists for grain, cloth, utensil and other products. Now they would have more ghee and wool because herding and hunting was a very prominent subsistence activity for them, but they would not have grain, but still they have to eat grain, so they will trade it with settled people. Now if nomads are bringing horses from Central Asia or West Asia, they will sell it and get some other cattle from local places. So such relationships of cooperation and conflict. The Banjaras were the most important trader nomads. Their caravan was called Tanda. Now this could be asked in prelims. What does Tanda mean? Easily a prelims question, okay? Sultan Alauddin Khalji used the Banjaras to transport grain to city markets, we discussed earlier. Jahangir wrote in his memoir that the Banjaras carried grain on bullocks from different areas and sold it in towns. They transported food for the Mughal army during campaigns. With a large army, there could be not a large army, I should say large caravan. There could be 100,000 bullocks carrying grain. Now imagine the length of a caravan in which you have 100,000 bullocks or bullock carts, right? Because they were the trains, they were the malgadi of that era. Okay, today you have these large container trains that a container train will sometimes has as many as 80. Though in youth, when you were young, you must have tried counting it whenever you are standing at a railway crossing. So they have so many containers behind them and they carry so much grain. So these were the railway tracks of that era. Any sort of trade will go through them. Okay, they're saying some of the caravans will be as long as 100,000 bullocks. Jahangir says in his biography. Similarly, an English trader, Peter Mundy, writes about them in 16th century. So this is how we get to know. Now Alauddin Khalji used them. How would we know? So Barni and some other historians are important source to understand Alauddin Khalji's market reform. So he must have written that he used Banjaras. Jahangir wrote his own biography. Peter Mundy, an English trader, he wrote a travelogue. So this is how we know about them. Many pastoral tribes reared and sold animals such as cattle and horses, obviously. Then you have small peddlers. They are also a kind of nomad, okay? Because they are going from village to village. They don't travel a long distance. Say they do not go from one region to another, but they do travel. They go from village to village. They sell small stuff. For example, even today we have people who sell bangles on their bicycle. If you recall, in villages you had people who sold ice cream and toffees and ask you for a bowl or a glass of grain in return. So they are the predecessors of such hawkers. Sometimes mendicants acted as a wandering merchant. Say they are coming from a place where you do have a particular medicinal plant or a herb, things like that we might call a psychotropic substance. Such things, they might have some things that may add to your hunger or some biological functions. They may aid some biological functions of body. So they may have such niche products along with them, these mendicants, and then they will sell it to people. There were castes of entertainers who performed in different towns and villages. If you recall, then we had given these examples for craft persons and traders, especially in the case of small traders. We had given these examples. Well, obviously they are nomads as well as traders, so these examples fit in both cases. Proliferation of jatis and longer hierarchies. Okay, as the needs of society grew, new skills were required. Smaller castes and jatis emerged within the varnas. New castes appear. An example is given that new castes appear among brahmanas. Okay, so these are called a sub-jati, a jati within a jati, sub-caste, because now there was more differentiation. Say a particular for example, there is a Brahman varna, okay, but now they are migrating from Often in this period we have seen that they migrate from the places like North India to the peripheral areas like Odisha or some other places where new states are emerging. Okay, so what they do, they go to those kings will give them land grant, they in turn will help them to gain legitimacy. So therefore, since different, there was this migration of Brahmanas. So what happened, that even caste emerged among Brahmanas, subcastes, and they were identified according to the area in which they lived. Okay, you have the 5 castes of North Indian Brahmanas, you have 5 castes of South Indian Brahmanas. This was a very common classification in medieval period. So since people are migrating to different regions, okay, so according to region in which they lived, they had a subcaste. This was the case of Brahmanas. See, on the other hand, so one was this, that because of proliferation of art and craft, new jatis are coming, and in the case of Brahmanas, new jatis came because of their migration. So you go to new area and another caste is created on the basis of the area in which you live. On the other hand, many tribes and social groups were added to caste-based society as new jatis. Now we are specifically talking about tribes. Specialized, why? Because they become member of settled societies by joining agriculture, or B, their interaction with settled society is become so frequent that even when they are not practicing agriculture specifically, they adopt certain unique craft activity. Specialized artisans, meaning smiths, carpenters and masons, were also recognized as separate jatis, right? Jatis rather than varna became the basis of organizing society, because up to this point there were so many jatis that to say the fourfold varna system appeared like an oversimplification. There were so many jatis and there were so many sub-jatis. Okay, if anything, the varna system only remained a larger framework. All right. Among Kshatriya, new Rajput clans became powerful by 11th, 12th century. They belonged to different lineages such as Hunas, Chandelas, Chalukyas and others. Some of these too had been tribes earlier. We will see the example of this in the case of Gond kingdom later. Many of these clans came to be regarded as Rajputs. They gradually replaced the older rulers, especially in agricultural areas. Here a developed society was emerging and rulers used their wealth to create powerful states. See, the rise of Rajputs during medieval period is a long and complex process. And we have identified some of the causes. A, the earlier Kshatriya Varna, which was the ruling class. Some of the members of the Kshatriya Varna turned into Rajput caste. Then, some of the foreign elements, say the descendants of Shaks, Kushans and Hun, since they were also ruling, okay, they also perhaps became part of the Rajput caste later on. Foreign elements, especially the ones that were ruling in their local area. Now some tribal groups, because of the increased wealth and their increased political power, we will see this in the case of Gond kingdom, they became Rajputs. And then people who, due to land grants made to them and their relatives and their communities, when they became prosperous, they adopted the ethos, moral values and rituals and practices of Rajput society. They also became part of the Rajput system. And if you recall, we had talked about the concept of Brahmachhatra, that ambitious ruler who was originally a Brahmin or someone else, but then he becomes a ruler. So to legitimize himself, he says that I have both Brahmin and Kshatriya blood in my family. So such people also migrated into the Rajput class. Okay, so there are a variety of factors, though right now it appears as an oversimplification because it is such, to study such things in detail. I mean, the rise of the Rajput class is a unique subject for history. So whenever you take optional subject, there you deal with these things in detail. You go into the each and every factor in detail. You understand the relationship between land grants and the increase in local political power of the particular lineages and the relationship with military grants in such classes. So it's a complex process. Many of these clans came to be regarded as Rajputs. They gradually replaced older rulers, especially say a clan has become a ruling class, but nearby them you have a clan which is a tribal people, or you conquer them, okay, you subjugate them and they become a lower caste, and but you are since ruling class, so you became Rajputs. Here a developed society was emerging, that means a settled society. Instead of developed, let's say a settled peasant society was emerging, and rulers used their wealth to create powerful state. Obviously, you will have wealth if there is agricultural surplus, okay, or you can tax it and such stuff. So the rise of Rajput class is closely linked to expansion of agriculture and increase in wealth and power of people that benefited from agriculture, and the other factors like the ancient Kshatriya class, the foreign elements, and some of the tribal societies that themselves emerged as state, they also joined the Rajput class. See how there were so many sub-jatis, or there was proliferation of jati. A 12th century inscription in Tamil Nadu describes the deliberation in a sabha. Now, what is a sabha? It is a village assembly that governed the Brahmadeya, the Brahmana villages. They deliberated on the status of a group known as Rathkaras, means chariot makers. That now they are important because chariot makers, it was a mode of transportation. It was the motorbike of that period, and a horse was attached to the top. You have lot of chariot makers, but what should be their status in the hierarchy of jatis? Because depending upon their status, then you will decide their purity, pollution situation and such stuff. So they deliberated that what rank should be given to them by giving them a particular jati. They laid down their occupations, which were to include architecture, building coaches and chariots, erecting gateways for temples with images in them, preparing wooden equipment used to perform sacrifices, building mandaps and making jewels for the kings. Now look, they are performing some very key religious and political functions. So it is very unlikely that they would be given a low caste status. Okay, because if you give them low caste status, then their ability to freely move and freely practice their occupation will be largely hindered. So in such a way, an occupation turned into a jati. What we had said here, that new skills were required, and the people that acquired those skills turned into jatis. So society became larger, became more complicated, it needed more goods and services. I mean, look today how with each new facility becomes a necessity, and then to meet that necessity you have a new occupation groups. You have Ola, Uber, okay, now they are not taxi drivers, they are separate from them. They don't own the Ola, Uber, but they are a particular occupation group. You have solar panels. Imagine earlier you only had say thermal electricity. Now you have solar as well. Now with solar comes a dedicated class of professionals that become expert in fitting the mechanics of solar cell. They are expert in assembling solar cell. They are expert in repairing it. If there is some maintenance issues, they will give you spare parts. Now what happens in modern times, that anybody who can take admission into those ITIs or those skill training institutes that teach you how to assemble solar cell or how do you become a mechanic of solar cell, anybody can become that. But in ancient times, how knowledge was transmitted? Knowledge was transmitted from generation to generation. So this is the difference between now and medieval and ancient time. Today, an occupation does not turn into a caste because you are free to move into it and you are free to move out of it. and only economic compulsions dictate whether you become a taxi driver or you become an IAS or you become a businessman. Your economic compulsions, guide them. But in ancient times, since knowledge was transmitted across generations and new knowledge was very rarely created or very slowly created, therefore very easily an occupation became a jati. Now in ancient period, a person or a community which was good at fitting solar panels could have become a jati. Now it would not become a jati. So this is the difference actually. This is how as societies grew, new skills were needed, and those who perfected those skills became a separate jati. Now it is possible, or a sub jati. Earlier they may have been a member of different jati. For example, here they are saying that they practice so many things. They build coaches and chariots, erect gateways, they do things for kings also. Now give a few hundred years and there might emerge some more jatis. There will be a jati that makes chariots, and there might be a jati who makes gateways. If the society becomes more larger, and then there is a dedicated profession for making temple gateways and a dedicated professions for making rath, and they are mutually exclusive, so they will also become separate jatis. The rise of Rajput clans to the position of rulers set an example for the tribal people to follow. Okay. Gradually, with the support of the Brahmanas, many tribes became part of the caste system. How? Because they will give land grants to Brahmanas. Brahmans will give them, you remember the origin myth, the prashasti, the legitimacy rule, that how you are a Brahmachatra, how you are a Chandravanshi or a Suryavanshi, how you are a descendant of Lakshman. So this is the symbiotic relationship between the priestly class and ruling class. But only leading tribal families could join the ruling class. Only the tribal family that ruled, only the clan that ruled that tribal society joined the Rajput caste. Rest of them, if you were peasants, then you will become Shudra. If you performed a certain craft activity, then or if that craft activity was not very much appreciated, then you might be given a status of untouchable as well. Though such social changes were very slow. I mean, right now we are saying as if it appears like a plan document, that okay, they come up with a plan like a project, and then okay, you become this caste, you become that caste. It's not that easy. These processes are slow and rather organic, if I may use the word. So only the ruling clans, once a tribal society becomes a peasant society and acquires all the trappings of a peasant society, the ruling clans will join the Rajput class, but the rest of them will become commoners and pick up different jatis according to the occupation they practice. On the other hand, many dominant tribes of Punjab, Sindh and northwest frontier had adopted Islam quite early. I mean, the moment they turn from tribal people to peasant people, okay, instead of joining a caste-based hierarchical society, they adopted Islam. So they skirted this process and they went into another direction. Quite early on, when they were ripe to adopt a settled way of life, they continued to reject the caste system. The unequal social order prescribed by Orthodox Hinduism was not widely accepted in these areas. Look, when a way of life changes, many other changes take place simultaneously. If you recall, we had talked about then when early Vedic society turned into a later Vedic society. What had actually happened? A tribal semi-pastoralist nomadic lifestyle was given up in favor of a settled agriculturist lifestyle. So in a way, the Vedic Aryans had turned from a tribal society to a peasant society. And see, so many other changes took place. The concept of kingship evolved, became more powerful. The religion and the gods they prayed to, that changed. Material changes took place. The society became more hierarchical. Right? There's so many varna. The fourfold varna system emerged at that point. Earlier they had only 3 varnas, but then in later Vedic period they had 4 varna. The position of women declined because obviously in a peasant compared to a tribal society, the position of women is rather downgraded in a peasant society. So when your subsistence pattern, the mainstay of your economic activity, your economy, the mainstay of your economy changes. Many other changes take place in society simultaneously, and quite often it is reflected in the religion you choose or the new religion you choose. Okay. So this happened in the case of, we are giving example of Punjab, Sindh and Northwest, that when they turned from say a tribal society to a peasant society, we gave the example of Khokhars and Ghakkars, that they adopted Islam at that point because Islam had already arrived in the area. It was politically a potent tool at that point, so they saw this as a more promising aspect. Also, they have given, there is this historian Richard Eaton. He talks about the Jat community, which was originally a pastoralist nomadic community. He says that the first reference to Jats is found sometime around 8th to 9th century in lower Indus Valley, okay, in Sindh area. Then they gradually moved upwards and reached around the upper Sindh in around 11th 10th century, and up to the medieval period they had settled into the larger Punjab area. Okay. Due to the innovation of Persian wheel, the agriculture had become very extensive, very extensively practiced in the region. If you recall, during the time of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, there was lot of public investment by the state in irrigation and canal irrigation and such. So due to the changes, the technological changes and change, that they moved into a fertile area from places like Sindh, etc. They moved into a fertile area. Also, there were changes in technology that made agriculture, more profitable than a tribal nomadic way of life. So their economic mainstay, their most valued economic activity change. So at that point they had options whether to join, a hierarchical Varna based society, or if they adopt other ways. But at that time, since Islam was a powerful political tool, it was dynamic. There were a lot of Sufi saints in the area that were gaining a lot of support. So in those circumstances they turned to Islam. Okay. The emergence of state is closely related to social change among the tribal people. Earlier I had given the example of Mongols. Okay. Genghis Khan realized that if he could unite the diverse Mongol tribes, he could create a very powerful tool. Similarly, we will see in the case of Gonds in the next slide that there were social changes due to which state arose. Now a closer look, we will see at two examples. Gonds, which lived in this area, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Maharashtra, Eastern MP, then some areas of Maharashtra and Andhra. And then we will see the example of Ahoms, which lived in the Brahmaputra Valley. See, after Malwa, if you recall, Akbar had attacked Garh Katanga, where he won lot of elephants and such. We will see that now. Gonds lived in a vast forested region called Gondwana. They practiced shifting cultivation. Okay, so they did practice agriculture, but in the shifting cultivation you cannot have much surplus. Okay, it's a very primitive way of practicing agriculture. You may have food security, you may grow enough to eat, and then if you don't have enough, then you can use the forest sources, you can use fruits, and you can hunt. But shifting cultivation is not going to give you much prosperity. The large Gond tribe was further divided into many smaller clans. Each had its own Raja. Okay, so there was this chieftainship. Okay, only chieftain. Not a very long hierarchy. As the Delhi Sultanate was declining, a few large Gond kingdoms were beginning to dominate smaller Gond chiefs. Political change is taking place. Something must have happened in the society. What we said earlier, the Akbarnama, that is almost a biographical account of Akbar's reign, says that the Gond kingdom of Garha Katanga had 70,000 villages. So see, it is certainly a large kingdom. Okay. Administration of these kingdoms was being centralized. Again, political changes are happening, means social changes have happened. Kingdom was divided into Gadh. Gadh means a stronghold. Literally, Gadh means strongholds, but here they will mean a territorial unit. Controlled by a Gond clan, it was further divided into units of 84 villages called Chaurasi. A Chaurasi was divided into barhuts made up of 12 villages each. So this was a way of regimenting the society, that there is a king at the top, then you have clan, and then you further divide it into smaller places. They will certainly pay taxes and tributes, though the system will not be as centralized, and the rigorousness of collecting taxation will not be as as strong as, say, a mansabdari system. Emergence of large states changed the nature of Gond society. See, this is the key point. The emergence of large states changed the nature of Gond society. A basically equal society slowly got divided into unequal classes. Social changes are happening. Okay. The Gond chief now wished to be recognized as Rajputs. There is a term called Sanskritization. The students of sociology use this word quite often, meaning once a particular class, a clan, becomes economically mobile, becomes socially mobile, it seeks, legitimization through adopting the rituals and practices and ethos of an already the upper strata of society. The Gond chiefs now wish to recognize as Rajputs. Brahmins received land grants from Gond Rajas and became influential. So what happens now? They will help you to adopt the way of life of Rajput class. They will help you to adopt the names. They will help you to perform those sacrifices. They will help you to arrange your administration and your religion and your social values accordingly. So Aman Das, the Gond Raja of Gadha Katanga, assumed the title of Sangram Shah. See, this is curious. Shah, okay, and Sangram. So what is first thing is change your name, okay. That is one way of sounding grand. This is something very similar like calling yourself Maharaja Dhiraj, where you have while you have a long chain of Samant who are constantly undermining you. Is something similar, adopting a lofty title. His son Dalpat married Princess. Now this is rather a story which is less significant compared to this slide. What we are saying, that as society was becoming unequal, the administrative centralization was happening and a state was emerging. What we see now is just a story. Okay. His son married Durgavati, the daughter of Chandel Rajput. Now see, now you are an upstart, you emerge from a tribal society, you have ambitions, so you created a strong centralized state. Though your taxation system would still be weak than an empire, but now you are upwardly mobile. Okay, you want to become a Rajput, you want to join the high status, high class of this society, so you adopt the name and you marry into an already established Rajput family. Dalpat, however, died early and Durgavati started ruling on behalf of her minor son. Under her, kingdom became more extensive. See, this is only a story part. What we wanted to emphasize has already been emphasized in the previous slide. In 1565, Mughal forces under Asaf Khan attacked Gadha Katanga. A strong resistance was put up, but both Durgavati and her son died. Katanga had earned much wealth. Now this is key. Why social inequality was happening? This is the key. Because economic inequality was taking place. The wealth was created and that wealth was primarily or predominantly appropriated by ruling class. This is the cause of social inequality, that wealth was generated. Sometimes it is generated by agricultural surplus, and then in that case ruling class appropriates as much as possible. Here wealth was generated, but by how? Exporting wild elephants to other kingdoms. See, elephants are tanks of that era. Okay, they were very important. When the Mughals defeated the Gonds, they captured a huge booty of precious coins and elephants, but they did not fully annex it. They left some part of it and left the rest to Chandra Shah, an uncle of Bir Narayan. So again, they realized that we cannot control such a large place. So only annex the key forts that are important to control routes or trade routes between Bengal and the places like Awadh, or the heartland of Mughal Empire. So rest of it was left to the local Raja. And obviously that person has to join your Mansabdari system, become your ally and such thing. Despite the fall of Gadha Katanga, the Gond kingdom survived for some time. However, they became weaker and later struggled unsuccessfully against Bundelas and Marathas. Then we give another example of Ahoms here. Now some of the names like Kacharis, Jayantiyas, Khasis, Garos, they are known even today. Here you have Arunachali tribes of Dafla, Miri, Abhor, Mishmi. You have Chutiyas, you have Koch Bihar here. You have Naga tribes. Ahoms migrated to the Brahmaputra valley from Myanmar region in 13th century. If you recall, when we were discussing the early medieval period, we talked about the the movement of ruling lineages, that they would be originally from one area, they will move to another area, and there they will put down their political roots. They will give military grants to the important members of their ruling lineage and start ruling. Something similar is here, that Ahoms actually came from Burma, modern Myanmar. They created a new strong state by suppressing the older bhuiyas or landlords. Obviously, you had military strength, so you gave each part to your ruling lineages. So, say smaller members of the lineage, they would be given the charge to first subdue the local zamindars and collect taxes. During the 16th century, they annexed the kingdom of Chutiyas and Koch Bihar, Koch Hajo. This is here and here. So now their rule will extend over a much larger area, right? This much. They used firearms as early as 1530. So technologically certainly advanced. See, another thing, if state has monopoly over coercive power, or the gap between king and the feudal chiefs is larger in terms of having military strength, that also aids centralization. Especially after the invention of gunpowder technology, it became very difficult to defend small forts, because a richer army will have more powerful and more number of guns and artilleries. So this is also a factor. The distribution of coercive power, if the imbalance is very large, then it will aid centralization. By the 1660s, they could make high quality gunpowder and cannons. Okay, so their power is already increased. However, the Ahoms faced many invasions from southwest, meaning from the direction of Bengal. See, the Mughal Empire, this was the frontier of Mughal Empire. So they were southwest, they will continuously attack you. Now attacking from this Meghalaya's mountainous area will be a bit difficult. So what they will do, they will attack from this direction, right? Continuously. Once they had established their stronghold over Bengal, in 1573 they won, but they had to again undertake many campaigns to fully subjugate Bengal. But from here, Mughal Empire will continuously launch raids. But see, this riverine track is very difficult to hold. So if locals, Ahoms being the locals up to this, becoming locals up to this point, they will have a better knowledge of geography of the area. Okay, therefore they were sometimes defeated by Mughals, but then they fought back, and eventually Mughals could never fully establish their control on this area. That is the point I want to convey. In 1662, Mughals under Mir Jumla, if you recall, when we were studying Aurangzeb, we said that the Ahoms were defeated, but very soon they fought back. Mughals under Mir Jumla attacked the Ahom kingdom. Despite their brave defense, Ahoms were defeated, but direct Mughal control could not last long, because very soon they fought back and almost entirely threw away Mughals from their region. Ahom state dependent upon forced labor. Those forced to work were called packs. Again, a prelims question could be asked here. Okay, that who is a pack? What does it mean? A census was undertaken and each village had to send a number of packs by rotation. People from heavily populated areas were shifted to less populated places. See the level of centralization. That you are undertaking forced labor or such a large scale, and you are easily able to move people from one region to another. So this was a very advanced state, not something you can say. They had moved far away from being a tribal egalitarian society. They came from somewhere else and they put down their political roots very firmly. By the first half of 17th century, the administration became quite centralized. Almost all adult males served in the army during war. It's a people's militia. At other times, they were engaged in building dams, irrigation systems, and other public works. Ahoms introduced new method of rice cultivation. See, technological change, meaning surplus. Society was divided into clans or khels. A khel controlled several villages. The peasant was given land by his village community. Even the king could not take it away without community's consent. Now, you can see a contradiction here, that at local level, even king cannot interfere in this. But on the other hand, you have everybody fighting the war when the war comes, or you have you have people doing forced labor. This might be the main form of taxation. So there is this contradiction. Something like what we saw in the case of Chol Empire, that the state is from the ruling from capital is very powerful, but at the local level there is a lot of autonomy. And this might be because Ahoms had come from outside. Originally, the Ahoms worshipped their tribal gods. During the first half of 17th century, the influence of Brahmanas increased. The temples and Brahmanas were given land grants. So again, the Sanskritization of Ahoms took place. In the reign of Seep Singh, Hinduism became the predominant religion, but the Ahoms did not completely give up their own way of life. So some kind of synthesis between the Brahmanization or the larger Hindu society and the Ahom way of life took place here. Ahom society was very sophisticated. Poets, though, see, these points were not given in the book, we have taken it so that we can emphasize the process of how the religious change took place in the Ahom society. As we had seen before, that economic changes, what we had said here, see, when a way of life changes, many other changes take place. An emergence of states is closely related to social change. So we are trying to emphasize same point here, that since the Ahom or the local way of life has changed, many other places changes are taking place, especially about the religion. Ahom society was very sophisticated. Poets and scholars were given land grants, theatre was encouraged. Important works of Sanskrit were translated into local language by Shankar Dev and his followers. Historical works, see, this is very curious, known as Buranjis. Again, could be a question in prelims, what does Buranji mean? Were also written in Ahom language and Assamese. This is not a common practice, writing historical work, but since they had their own sense of historical consciousness, they commissioned historical works. Now, I wanted to emphasize the role of a Bhakti saint, Shankar Dev. He was a Vaishnav saint. He built on past traditions to devise new forms of music, theatre, dance, literary language. Bhagavat of Shankar Dev is an Assamese adaptation of Bhagavad Puran. So you are seeing the full scale religious change, because the way of life has changed. Okay, state has emerged, social inequality has taken place. Therefore, even religious changes are also happening at the same time, and all of them are reinforcing each other. Bhagavatic religious movement he started, called Ekasaran Dharma, influenced two medieval kingdoms, Koch and Ahom. This was the main point I wanted to emphasize, that religious changes were taking place that were simultaneously aiding the centralization as well as facilitating the economic changes as well, and vice versa. The monastic centers called Satras, this is just additional information, and house of prayers called Namghar that were started by him continued later on as well. So a religious change. Now in this case, example is different. They joined the Bhakti movement, but in the case of Punjab, Sindh, Northwest, the example was different. But what was similar, that tribal societies were turning into peasant societies. At last, we can see the conclusion that there were many different tribes during these 1,000-year periods, but peasant societies and tribal people constantly interacted with each other, forcing both to adapt. Okay, often, but though to be fair, you can say that it was almost always that the tribal society became peasant society. Only for brief periods, tribal societies managed to dominate the peasant societies. Over a period of time, many of them were incorporated into peasant societies that were organized into a hierarchy of jatis, but not in all the cases, as we saw in the case of. However, some did not accept the caste system in Orthodox Hinduism, say in the example of Northwest, but then some did. Okay, say in the case of Gonds, and even Ahoms became very much Hinduized. Some tribes established extensive states with well-organized systems of administration and became politically powerful. Okay, this brought them in conflict with larger and more complex states and empires. And my favorite example is always Mongols. And not only Mongols, if we look into the history, the Huns, that were the repeated Hunnic invasion of North India, was one of the reasons why Gupta Empire declined. The Turks, that were once during the 10th and 11th century, Turks were the main defender of Islam in Central Asia and also the main aggressor against Islam in Central Asia. Okay, they were also a nomadic people. They constantly interacted with Persian speaking peasant society and eventually adopted the Persian way of life. Then they established sultanates across Central Asia and then in India. The Huns, the example I gave. The decline of Roman civilization, that was also caused by the same barbarians that the tribes like Goths, Visigoths and such tribes, such Germanic tribes, that the Roman historians called barbarians in a derogatory manner. So the relationship between the tribes and settled societies is rather complex, and this was the message of this chapter. We will see chapter 8 in the next lecture. Thank you.